Good afternoon. This is Jan Walker. I am an account manager with ECG, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today for our Cisco and BroadSoft What's Next webinar. A couple of housekeeping items first. I want to let you know that we'll be taking questions. If you have those in the chat, place those there and we'll address those as they come up. Your presenter today is Mark Lindsey. Most of you probably already know him. He's VP of Engineering for ECG. Among the items he'll be talking about today will be the latest news from the Cisco BroadSoft merger, information from the Cisco Collaboration Summit, which was held a couple weeks ago, and I think we met a number of you there. We'll also be talking about what Cisco is going to do now that they have 3 cloud calling platforms with HCS, Spark, and BroadSoft. We'll compare Call Manager, HCS, and BroadWorks, and discuss some migration strategies. Certainly, if you have questions, as I mentioned, place those in the webinar chat, and we'll take care of those there. The recording of the webinar, that's the first question that's come up, and we are recording this, and we will be sending a link to the recording out to all participants, so you can feel free to share that as you wish. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark.
Great, thanks Jan. I appreciate that introduction. And like Jan mentioned, we've got the chat window, so feel free to write your questions in there and Jan will bring those to our discussion here. So if you're having any problems with video or audio, then like we said, you can watch the recording again later. We'll be sure that you get that, and that you've got any, if you've got any follow-up questions that you think of after our presentation today, then we'll be glad to talk about that and to discuss that more. So this is a little bit more of agenda. So we'll go into the merger process. We'll talk about for folks who are new to the BroadSoft, BroadWorks world, we'll talk about the introduction to that and an implementation. We'll look at the Cisco Collab side, especially on Unified Communication Manager and HCS, and sort of do a little bit of an introduction there. We'll talk about one of the big issues that folks bring up a lot is third-party devices and what's the future for that. We'll talk about a question that comes up a lot too, which is what is Cisco doing with 2 cloud calling platforms? And then we'll bring you some of the ECG analysis on these things based on what we've been told, what's been publicly announced, and our inferences from long experience with these 2 companies. So like it says here, these opinions are just ECG. So we're an independent consulting company. We do technical consulting and implementation for companies around the world, and we're partners with practically every telecommunications company out there. So we're bringing you some independent analysis here that can help you with your strategy and your long-term success. So ECG has been doing BroadSoft and Cisco implementations together since about 2003. And we've been doing, as a team, different software engineering and telecom integration projects since about 1990. And our engineering is focused on service providers, major enterprises, and public sector space. So these are usually government sides, organizations, federal or municipalities or state-run organizations. We've got, in addition to the engineering team, of which I'm a part, we have a 24/7 operations and security team. So these are the guys who watch for things like toll fraud, or they do analysis on security events that happen in networks. And so that team's available to you to help you operate your network and maybe cover some of those difficult hours with some high-level expertise. So the BroadSoft and Cisco merger, as you know, it's happening. So there was no holdup in the approval of this. We've got Michael Tesler shown here on the slide here. So he was called the king of cloud calling, and he's been brought in to run the cloud calling organization at Cisco. So he's got the BroadSoft BroadWorks with UC1 BroadCloud. So all of that is under his portfolio, as he announced. But also he's got Cisco HCS under his portfolio as well. So those are, and he's working a lot with Cisco HCS customers he mentioned. The first stages of the BroadSoft-Cisco merger from our perspective are things like the BroadSoft employees finding their place and their assignments within the Cisco organization. We welcome any of you guys who are long-term friends from BroadSoft and Cisco here on our meeting today. Glad to have you here, and would love to get your feedback and comments. Folks are finding their place, but some of the final decisions about the product are really just not out yet. So there's a lot of discussion about what the answers for partners, and we'll provide our analysis on and what we can tell you. about that so far, but also there's some questions about product and where the product is going to go in different places. And so there are some preliminary answers and some directions that are being set out of the Cisco organization that we'll be able to discuss today. So Michael Tesler at the Cisco Collab Summit mentioned it's a funny thing that when you've competed against something like Cisco HCS for such a long time to suddenly be running it. And so he's responsible for that organization, which is maintaining the Cisco HCS. He's working with those customers to understand who's using HCS, why they're using it. As he said, kind of what are the downfalls of HCS, and he's also looking at a lot of the things that are available on the broad cloud side that he can bring into HCS. That's been the announcement. So that's a interesting perspective that he was able to bring from the Collab Summit. The interesting decision that we see from Cisco is putting Mike Tesler in charge and making him responsible for the Cisco HCS calling, and it's a recognition of kind of the leading role that BroadSoft really brings to the discussion and to the Cisco partner ecosystem. So we're going to talk a little bit about BroadSoft for folks who may be new to it, or folks who've worked with it in the past but haven't dug in a lot, or if you're just much more familiar with other platforms like the Cisco Collab platform, then this should be helpful for you. So BroadSoft was originally built for service providers, so telephone companies. A lot of the folks who were at BroadSoft from the beginning and who had the thoughts for the architecture. These were folks who were thinking futuristic thoughts at Nortel in the late 90s and early 2000s. So they were thinking about where telecom was going to go as Nortel was changing and then going through convulsions at the end of that era. And so these folks brought their experience directly into BroadSoft. So when they started BroadSoft, they started with a deep service provider philosophy and understanding. And they brought also sort of you could say a Web 1.0 philosophy to how to provide an interface for folks. The name BroadSoft sort of harkens back to the days when broadband was a major player, and it was a big inflection point in the industry where folks went from having very low speed or intermittent access to the internet to high speed continuous access to the internet. And so BroadSoft was built to exploit that for the collaboration space. Telephone companies and large enterprises both can use BroadSoft. Large enterprises kind of were one of the things that came a little bit after the telephone company focus, but it's a natural fit because large organizations often run their own service provider organization inside. So a large enterprise, such as a state government or a division of the federal government here in the United States, might have basically a telephone company that they're operating, which was historically might have been implemented by a large number of distributed PBXs, but is actually better collapsed into a single unified platform, so for better management and redundancy. It's been a multi-tenant architecture since the very beginning, so it was always designed on the expectation that you're going to have multiple tenants. There's very few things that are decisions that you would make about one tenant that you can't change for another tenant, even though they're running on the same server. So you get a mixture of efficiency, but you also get a mixture of a lot of flexibility. There's a heavier reliance within BroadSoft on integration with partner companies. So BroadSoft had a particular focus on, they never made endpoints or gateways or session border controllers, and so they always expected to integrate with these other companies. So the endpoints such as SIP phones or ATAs or IADs, PSTN gateways, those kind of devices were always something that BroadSoft had to work really well with in order to be a successful product. Whereas from the Cisco perspective, they've always had a lot of strength in these different areas, and they provided integrated products from the beginning. So this kind of developed two different strengths across the two different companies from our perspective. BroadSoft had to work really hard on open APIs and manageability in order to make a system that actually would be interoperable and provide 100% of the features through somebody else's endpoint device. And so they never had the flexibility of having, programmer Alice and programmer Bob who could sit in the same building and work together to make a fully integrated product. They had programmer Eves in Montreal working with another programmer in Portugal, and they had to work together to make an integrated product. And that difference really forced them into a very high quality of documentation, very high quality published interface, contracts through those APIs. And those are the things ECG works with a lot. We work with those APIs on our provisioning product, Alpaca, but also on a lot of integration products. So our companies will come to us, our clients will come to us and ask us to help them onboard a new type of device, or maybe help them bring a new product to market. So BroadSoft is being used by really nearly all of the major service providers that are out there. So AT&T has a number of BroadWorks installations. There's Verizon. There's also Verizon Wireless that have different things. You remember that all of your VoLTE calling is actually a type of VoIP calling. So when you have a SIP phone that's making VoIP calls and it says LTE on it, and then it's actually making calls across a SIP signaling network. And BroadWorks is part of some of those networks. We've also got very large installations in France from Orange, but also there's Orange in the United States. That is a distinct entity. BT has BroadWorks among their portfolio of products. Vodafone, Telstra, around the world, we see a lot of BroadWorks installations at the large scale because of the efficiency and the robustness of the product. BroadSoft has really proven, just like their peers and competitors so far at Cisco, being at success of being able to make robust, reliable products. There's a lot of municipalities and cities and states here in the U.S. that are operating BroadWorks platforms. Sometimes you'll have, there's a lot of universities, especially multi-campus universities, that are fairly large-scale institutions that historically would have operated perhaps a bunch of patchwork PBXs that were integrated with tie lines or with SIP interworking between them. And a single BroadWorks installation or a geo-redundant BroadWorks installation can be used to provide service, and with a big reduction in complexity across there. And as I mentioned, the U.S. federal government has publicly announced a number of installations of BroadWorks, and you can Google and read about those and see the contractors who are working on those as well. So there's a lot of different brand names here. So for folks who are relatively new to the BroadSoft world, I just wanted to review the brand names a little bit that we see. The interesting thing about BroadSoft is even though they had a brand, their brand was mostly a presentation to service providers. So if you're in the Cisco side and you've got a brand like the ASR router series, that's mostly a product that's being sold to service providers. That's not a product that has where they're advertising it on CNN on a normal basis. Whereas at BroadSoft, BroadWorks, BroadCloud, UC1, those are similar categories where these are business-to-business deals, and they're selling their services and marketing these brands to service providers and organizations that wish to become service providers. They want to become organizations that are offering service to a large number of subscribers, or they're large-scale institutions such as, like I mentioned, a division of government or a large university. So BroadSoft is the corporation name. So in the Cisco community, we often will talk about BroadSoft because BroadSoft was where the merger happened. But within the insiders often would refer to these other sub-products. So for example, BroadWorks is distinct from BroadCloud, which is distinct from UC1 in some way, which is distinct from Team1 and CC1 and some of the other products across this. In our brief webinar today, I'm not going to try to cover all of the possible product names. And of course, if you've got a question about a particular one, we've reserved some time today to cover those kind of questions. So if there's some sort of detail you'd like to talk about, then please do bring that to the chat. So BroadWorks is the entire cloud and data center software suite. So BroadWorks is the software that we as integrators and service providers will install and operate. It runs primarily on Linux servers. You do have the option of using Oracle Linux as another option. You can use CentOS. You can use Solaris x86 for most of that product line. But the major service providers, the largest number of installations are using Red Hat Enterprise Linux or CentOS. Those are really the top installations there. And so there's a number of different products and sort of parts and pieces that are done by provided within BroadWorks. So we've got the basic call control, which is routing calls in and out from the PSTN or from other service providers. We've also got calling to and from just endpoint devices, including things like your desk phone, but also your soft clients that might be running on a mobile device. You've got the voicemail system is also part of that. It's also part of the same BroadWorks. So that's an interesting distinction between the different types of companies here. I'm going to pull this back up. So we've got voicemail within the call control portfolio there. We've also got call center, which is also implemented. Actually, these are implemented on the same server for the most part. We've got meetings and messaging and presence and collaboration and screen sharing. These actually operate on different servers that are also provided by BroadSoft. And then you have device management. So that's actually getting the right configuration to put the right buttons and the right display on the endpoint devices. So whether that's a soft client running in a mobile device or whether that's a desk phone, such as a Polycom or a Mitel, Astra, or a Yealink or a Cisco phone or any other vendor. So some of the interesting BroadWorks distinctives kind of in the context of the Cisco ecosystem, and especially in the context of the WebEx ecosystem as well, which is some of the new announcements coming out, that BroadWorks can be fully deployed without the internet. So it was voice over internet protocol, but it was not necessarily voice over the internet. Now, obviously, voice over the internet is a very popular implementation, and it's the right fit for a lot of users. But one of the nice things about this this model that BroadSoft has really pushed for is that you can build a private network that's able to completely offer these services. Now, how is that different from classic CUCM or HCS? It's not. You can clearly build a private network that's able to operate and offer those services. But where this is a distinctive is in the sort of the going forward path. So the integration with WebEx as the collaboration, the meeting platform is kind of the new thing. And so we're going to talk about some of those questions there. But generally, the BroadWorks implementations using the software that's available and that's being updated and upgraded right now, it provides the full feature set. So that's screen sharing, that's video meeting, that's of course one-to-one video and audio calling. That's the ability to use mobile devices as part of those meetings, the ability to be joined in and have a private room that you can do meetings on. Those can all be implemented on private servers that you operate without the internet. Another kind of interesting distinctive is that they provide the full feature set on every device. And so the collaboration, video, and presence, so for example, being able to monitor whether my coworkers are on the phone or not, works no matter what device they're using and I'm using. So there's a wide variety of devices that fully implement the standards, the open SIP standards, and then a few BroadSoft additional features that allow us to monitor the line state and the availability of users on other BroadWorks platforms. And so I don't need any special, there's no blessed model of device, there's an open API. These open standards have allowed BroadWorks operators the flexibility and have driven a lot of competition. So you might have, for example, at one organization, you might have Cisco third-party phones, and then another organization, you've got a legacy installation of Polycom phones, and another installation, you've got Mitel phones, just based on perhaps where these customers were and the tariff situation, or what kind of availability of offerings they were able to find. And across all those organizations with different models of phones, they can all do video calling, they can all monitor and collaborate on the presence, they can all use the full feature set of screen sharing and other kinds of meeting functionality that are part of that. So by use of these open standards, the different features are available across a wide set of phones. And that is a BroadSoft distinctive. We'll talk a little bit more about where that's going in the future, and I'd be interested from you guys to hear your insight and your thoughts as well. Some of the BroadSoft components, just to introduce where what we're talking about, and as you sort of move into service providers and you get opportunities to work with large enterprises that have these implementations, hopefully this information will be useful to you. So I've outlined the major types of devices that are in the network. So the top left here, we've got the application server, and the application server is the primary server that provides most of the call control features and applications. And the interesting thing about the BroadSoft model is that this application server can be licensed, and it can provide a wide range of services. So for example, ordinary calling, person-to-person calling is handled by the application server, but also is any special treatment that needs to be done for emergency calling, but also line hunting and call center features. So the ability to hunt and to enter a call queue and to be played greetings and to record the status of how long you waited in the greetings and record the statistics that call center operators need to have, such as call queue wait time, to be able to route calls based on skills-based routing or track abandonments of calls. That's all implemented in the same application server. Now, of course, you're not required to have only a single application server in your network. Most of the large implementations will have multiple application servers, and ECG's tool alpaca is the only way to move traffic between these different platforms out there. And so that's what it's there for, is allowing you to move traffic and also monitor. It gives you a view of everything that's happening on all of the different platforms across the different throughout a BroadWorks network. So a single, even though I've only got one box here on this simplified diagram, a single BroadWorks service provider could easily have 20 of these application servers spanning different parts of the globe, or perhaps they're all have different verticals associated. So this might be a healthcare application server where we do our maintenance in a different way than we do for our residential application server. And so we could do, we can implement and we can organize and move traffic between application servers whenever we need. The network server is a complementary server, and its primary job is implementing some policies related to routing of calls to and from the PSTN. So the public switch telephone network, basically the rest of the world, whether that rest of the world is using SIP or using other kinds of standards or their cell phones. The network server is basically that gateway device for entering and exiting the BroadWorks network. So you might have one network server cluster and then a large number of application servers, and the network servers have information replicated from all those application servers so that they can route calls appropriately between the different application servers, implement the right features, maybe even route calls and route users based on the location of those users or the numbers that are being dialed. It can also implement policies that are intended to block toll fraud. You can implement policies in the network server that allow you to route to a particular gateway. So for example, if you've got some customers in South Africa, but your home base is in the UK, then you might have your users in the UK normally using your UK-based gateways, but then when one of those users in South Africa picks up the phone and makes a call, we want to route that call out through that South Africa gateway, that PSTN gateway, so that we can reach the local networks and all the local dialing patterns there without having to go through international trunks into South Africa. Well, the network server does that. Those are the kinds of policies that it can do, and you can implement there in the network server. And it's implemented as a distinct component with a SIP interface between the application server and the network server. So BroadWorks operators can see that traffic crossing back and forth. We've got the media server, and this one media server is used for a wide variety of applications, including where it's what we call in the Cisco world, we call an annunciator service, but also a recording service and DTMF detection, but also mixing of audio and video can also be done on this media server. And so we can use it for meet me conferencing. So when we call in, we can have a large number of people in this media server is mixing traffic together. Of course, you're going to have a number of media servers split throughout the network. And you, as the BroadWorks operator, can choose to whether you want to, historically, you wanted to get some of these services from another company, or you wanted to co-locate your media servers in a hosting provider like Amazon Web Services, or you just want to operate them in your own data center. And so you have the control over where that media resource is placed. The profile server is a kind of file server. That's its primary job. There's a little bit more to it than that, but it's primarily a file server. So it's used to store things like the data from call center reports, and also the files that are used to manage devices, but also logs and a few other applications as well as part of the process of generating reports. So those reports are operated, generated by, and on and stored on the profile server. We've got a couple of other servers focused on messaging and screen share, and there's some interesting, some news about kind of where those messaging servers, so if you're from the BroadSoft community, we call those the UMS and USS servers, are a couple of those major servers. On the top right corner here, we've got the email server that stores voicemail. So this is not a BroadSoft component, BroadWorks provided component, it's just an email server. So one of the interesting BroadSoft distinctives from the beginning was the application server actually implements voicemail, and so everyone who has a BroadWorks implementation already has a voicemail system as it is. And you can use any email server that supports SMTP and POP3 or IMAP to store your voicemail. So it just stores those voicemails in a regular mailbox. And that's a pretty nice feature to have. Most of the substantial BroadWorks service providers have special mail servers that they're using this for, sometimes because if your voicemail has any kind of patient record, such as HIPAA-related data, where you're identifying whether customers or your end users or somebody else is calling into any kind of clinical environment where there's patient data that's stored, then you may need to implement HIPAA regulations and rules and privacy requirements on that voicemail. And so it makes a lot of sense in those contexts. Or also, if you've got sensitive data where you've got voicemails, so voicemails are regulated personal information, and we want to store that and be able to audit that and manage access to that voicemail in the right way. And so often we'll have dedicated email servers, but it gives you a lot of flexibility about which email server did you want. Of course, you can go all the way from open source all the way to lightly supported applications, but there's some very nice email servers out there because of the ISP market and the enterprise email market that allow you to have quality, redundant, scalable email service that you can use as your storage function for your voicemail system. On the other hand, you can also just store your voicemails in Gmail if that's what you want. So BroadWorks doesn't actually care as long as you give it an IMAP or a POP3 and an SMTP interface. There's a database server, which is really a packaged version of the Oracle RDBMS. And so that's another function within the BroadWorks system. And that's used primarily for a couple of features where there's a very large volume of data for logging purposes. The biggest one that comes up is call center reporting. So as you've got users who are calling into BroadWorks managed platforms, you'll store that data in the database server. And that database server is accessible. You can log in on the Oracle interface. You can pull data out of it. So it's an open standard server. It's running on Linux. You can scale that server kind of all the way down to very small, all the way up to very large. It supports a lot of the Oracle, the basic features there that are provided through Oracle for a large scale database. There's another server that's interesting, especially the Cisco community, called the AMS, the Access Mediation Server, which is a skinny protocol server. And so this lets you, as it shows in the diagram here, it lets you have Cisco skinny phones that can connect inbound to the network and so that we can have skinny phones with skinny features that can connect and speak to the rest of the BroadWorks network. We've got the XSP web server, which is there's a number of different XSPs you can deploy. It's a very low cost, low license cost server historically, and it lets you provide a web interface to users. It's also the interface for provisioning APIs, but it also does some of the heavy lifting for generating of web interfaces for your users who are logging in to use the collaborative BroadSoft features. And then we've got another server on the bottom right, which is a session border controller. So these session border controllers are the devices that are providing your hosted NAT traversal, your firewall traversal, your SIP trunking. Provides a lot of security features, and ECG does a lot of training and consultation where we do the technical implementation. We look at whether the security has been implemented fully in the session border controller. We do some penetration testing to sort of check to be sure whether your session border controller is fully implemented. And then sort of complementary to that, of course, we have an entire network architecture that has to be built securely. And so that's been one of the things that BroadWorks service providers, just like Cisco Collab customers, have to think about, which is building an entire network that's secure end-to-end. Session border controller is a very obvious element of that because our SBCs that we monitor and support are under constant attack. We have an old joke, how do you know if a session border controller is under attack from the internet? Well, the question is it on the internet? And if the answer is yes, then it's under attack. And that's what we see. So we're designing session border controllers and also firewalls so that they're under the expectation that we're constantly under attack. The attack is an everyday thing. I don't need an intrusion detection system because it would be going off all the time, but I do need an intrusion prevention system. And I say that partially in jest because when you actually do have some sort of breach in your network, you do want a system to detect it, and that is one of the roles of an IDS for sure. And so devices like the session border controller, the AMS, but also your firewalls and router infrastructure have to be deployed properly to protect this network from attack by the great unwashed general internet. The PSTN providers typically, like it shows here in the bottom right there in the orange cloud, the PSTN providers typically are going to communicate with your session border controller. That's not a BroadWorks specific requirement, but it's a common implementation that you would have. And what I'm showing here is a non-redundant view of this network. I'd be glad to take any questions. Just type them in the chat box for those of you who were able to join late. The UC1 is it's a go-to-market name. It's a package of all the things I just talked about in BroadWorks, but it's also the mobile applications as well. And so the mobile applications are applications that provide the software running on Android devices, iOS devices, but also on PC and Mac devices that allow you to make and receive calls, but also use the other collaboration features such as meeting and screen share and the video chat and video meetings. And so the mobile applications are kind of the hot stuff here. So the mobile applications are very exciting because they allow a service provider to have a branded, managed application in the App Store. So both in the Google Play App Store, in your private enterprise app stores. For example, if you have an environment with managed profiles on your mobile devices, you can have a private deployment, but you can also have it in the Apple App Store. And if you go and look right now, you'll find UC1 implementations from 20 or 30 major service providers today that have a branded application. So you might ask, well, what's the point? Is this branding only for logos and colors and style sheets and fonts? And that's clearly you can do that kind of branding. Absolutely, that really matters to having a smooth user interface. But in addition to that, we need, in order to meet the security standards of the different platforms and of modern users who are under attack themselves on their devices, we have to be able to have an authenticated, authorized interface between the push notification providers, such as Apple and Google, and our mobile application, so that when your system as a BroadWorks operator needs to route a call to my iPhone, then it's going to be able to send through the Apple push notification system a message. Apple needs to get that notification from the authentic software developer, so the organization that has the right to sign the application. And then it needs to authorize and confirm that that's a legitimate push notification, and then using the encrypted, authorized, authenticated protocols from Apple that's going to push that notification down to the application, and so that it can be securely delivered to the application. The cool thing here is that this solves a problem that's kind of a long-standing problem of how do you provide an energy-efficient way of delivering a call to a mobile device so that the battery's not alive, you're not constantly having to SIP re-register messages or any kind of other keep alive, SIP, keep alive traffic. How do you do that? But then also, how do you do it securely? And so the UC1 is, and it's gone under some other names, including BroadTouch Business Communicator. The communicator apps provide a mechanism for a service provider to brand their own deployment of the UC1 apps, push them to the App Store as an application. For example, ECG could have a version. There's one from a company, a partner company, a sister company of ours called NG Telecom, but also AT&T and Telstra and everyone else. Every organization that has BroadWorks can brand their own. In fact, you can brand multiples if you'd like to. Push them out there so you can have iPhone and iPad and Android phone and Android tablet versions as much as you'd like. Push those out there, and then as calls come into these to your users who are registered and active on these mobile applications, those push notifications can go through the Google infrastructure, Google Cloud Communication infrastructure, and also the Apple push notification system, and route those requests down to that device so that this device can sit here with the battery off nearly all the time, and the system will be able to deliver calls to it in a reliable way. Now, when it wakes up, the interesting thing is it actually uses SIP. So the application wakes up, it sends off a SIP, either a register message or a register, and then an invite, and it basically grabs that call using a SIP protocol. And so after the initial push notification to deliver the message, we're using standard SIP after that point. And so you can use your existing session border controllers or in any other SIP infrastructure you've got to do that. Another kind of one of the neat features about this is that it allows, by pushing out branded applications to the devices, it allows you to have integration with the local dialers on the Android and the Apple devices. And so when you dial a call, you can set up your dialer so that you can dial out through your BroadWorks line. And so rather than having to have your user leave the app that was built in on their phone and go to, so for example, we've got the basically our basic app here. This basic app can be set up so that it's actually, when I dial here, I'm actually dialing on the BroadWorks UC1 line. And so I'm making that call through my BroadWorks SIP interface. I don't have to leave it in order to take advantage of that. I don't have to leave, for example, in this case, the AT&T world and sort of make a conscious decision that, well, I'm not going to use the AT&T dialer. which has the handy little green phone. I've got to use some other application to make a call. I don't have to put that cognitive load on my users if I can integrate my dialer into the default dialer of the system. And in order to do that on these platforms, you have to have a branded application that's signed by a developer, approved by Apple, pushed out of the App Store, and then used by your user. And so that's what UC1 gives you, is it gives you a lot of that infrastructure that allows you to have a branded presence on your customer's endpoint device. The users don't have to learn a new app. So BroadCloud, I'll touch on just briefly here, is it's the BroadWorks features, but it's operated by BroadSoft. So basically it's BroadWorks. There's some provisioning and management, user interface, and control stuff that's very substantial and of very high quality that's provided by BroadSoft, but basically they're operating it for you. And so this is a way for BroadSoft to offer services through resellers that have no equipment whatsoever. And so you can be a small reseller that you go out there, and your job is to go put phones on local locations. You have to help your end user with the deployment of their local network. You have to get them on the internet. You may need to solve other problems such as emergency calling. You get them, but you do have a lot of flexibility on how you're going to route their calls, who you're going to get your numbers from, and therefore that's going to set your rates on your PSTN calling traffic. So you do have some flexibility, but on the other hand, you don't have to run the BroadWorks server yourself. So all that BroadWorks stuff, they're running it for you. All those servers, they're running that in geo-redundant data centers, which honestly sounds a lot like the Cisco WebEx strategy, the Cisco Spark WebEx strategy, where they've been operating a big network. And really, that's where a lot of the synergy is expected to happen, and what's discussed at the Cisco Collab Summit was basically saying, well, BroadCloud, for those of you who know BroadCloud, they were basically saying, well, we already had a pretty big network, but Cisco has an even bigger network, and so the BroadCloud network is expected to potentially integrate with or fold into that WebEx network. And it makes sense from a routing and switching and infrastructure and transport capability. They really should be the same network before very long. In terms of what servers and functions are running in the two different networks, that's obviously two different things. The BroadCloud system was running BroadSoft software. Cisco Spark WebEx was running the software appropriate for that. But in terms of having a common geo-redundant, highly scalable managed network, it makes all the sense in the world that those would be the same network. And so that's what we really hope to see. And all the indications were that that's the direction it's moving. But BroadCloud resellers can offer BroadCloud with no equipment whatsoever in the carrier side. So there's no data center required for the BroadCloud reseller. But the BroadCloud resellers do have a local responsibility to get phones or IaaS or ATAs or soft clients deployed to your customers, allow them to use them, help them set up those things, make them work successfully, and then support those customers in their endpoint questions and their growth and moves, adds, changes, disconnects. So I wanted to give you this view briefly of a typical BroadWorks deployment. So a typical BroadWorks deployment wouldn't have just the one set of servers that I showed you. It would actually be a geo-redundant deployment. You'd have two data centers. And there's a couple of cool features here I want to point out. One is they can be in two different locations easily. And in fact, in a lot of deployments, they're actually spreading out across more than just two locations, but two locations would be kind of your classic geo-redundant deployment. I've got an application server on the East Coast, and I've got an application server on the West Coast. Or I've got an application server in the northern US, and I've got an application server in the southern US. Or in some other cases, I've got an application server in Hong Kong, and I've got an application server in the US. And so because I've got my customers all over the globe. So that's true geo-redundant. When you actually have the curvature of the earth involved, that's real geo-redundancy. So we would have our different servers dispersed at the distributed and deployed at the two different locations. And then we would have links between these two networks. These would be private links so that you can carry private traffic. It would be ideal for this to be encrypted links or links that you own. So if you happen to own the dark fiber, that would be great. But most service providers are leasing access to other folks' links. There's a lot of use of MPLS, but there's also a lot of use of encryption over the internet to connect between different sites. We would have our email servers distributed. So there's some nice email server software out there, such as SurgeMail, that can replicate traffic, replicate the voicemails between the two platforms. And one of the nice things about this architecture is if one of the sites is offline or inaccessible, then the other site is fully capable of taking traffic. So it's an active system. So your data center A may have a certain set of users on the West Coast, and due to network conditions, all those West Coast users are able to communicate with data center A, and all your East Coast users are able to communicate with data center B. And they're going to be able to continue to function and operate to the extent that they're able to connect to the rest of the world. Both of these sites can operate in an independent way. And then when the network partition is repaired, so that both sides can now reconnect, then BroadWorks automatically handles that reconvergence and allows those, synchronizes everything. So for example, if I'm on the East Coast and I've got a colleague on the West Coast, and I'm not going to be able to see the integration between the line status of the two lines until we get reconnected again. So ECG and BroadWorks, like I mentioned, we've been training folks on implementing this for a long time. We train engineers and sales teams, and we'd be glad to talk to you more. We'd love to talk some more about kind of what's going on in your network and whether this makes a fit for you. Let's talk about Cisco collaboration. This is a little bit more background, and then let's talk about some of the sort of what's coming next. Like, where are things going now that with a platform of features and functions here. So the heart of the calling features are on the Cisco Unified Communication Manager platform. It was initially built, and it's still marketed as a PBX replacement in a enterprise or local site. The CUCM doesn't intrinsically do the voicemail for you or call center, and so for example, voicemail is usually deployed with Cisco Unity, and then you've got the role of session border controller. It's deployed and filled in different ways. And so what we see here is kind of a radically different model from the way BroadSoft is typically deployed. So if you're an organization and you're probably going to be, as a sales organization or a partner of Cisco, you're probably going to tend to be working with organizations that are more on the BroadSoft side of the spectrum or the Cisco side of the spectrum. In most cases, there's relatively few organizations that simultaneously operate both, although we're told there are 3 to 5 who kind of operate both and have a strong presence in both. For example, BT is one of those companies that has made announcements to that effect. And so if you're deploying sort of more towards an enterprise focus, then the Cisco call manager, communication manager is going to be that fit for that model. And so the question is, well, where's that going to next? Let's talk about the Cisco and WebEx and kind of this new model for collaboration that they're pushing us towards. So as you see here on the diagram, we've got the Cisco phones communicating normally through the SBC, which could be Cube or Perimeter in the classic deployments that the Cisco recommends. They're the architectures, but the meeting functions are largely moving out of the CUCM neighborhood, and they're moving to WebEx. So that was kind of one big announcement, is that in addition to kind of Cisco Spark calling, that we wanted to have a full integration where meeting capabilities are provided through the WebEx functionality. When we want to take a CUCM installation, multiple CUCM installations, and sort of those platforms and roll them up into a single data center, then that's where HCS comes in. And so HCS provides you a way to take a local call manager installation and seamlessly move that to a single common site. And HCS has certain tools, provisioning and management tools that assist with that. But the going forward plan, as announced, is that a lot of the collaboration, the meeting functions would be provided through WebEx. And so you would have an integration between your HCS deployments and WebEx. Well, as you can see here, this is substantially different from the BroadSoft model. And so one of the big questions is, well, what's happening next now that BroadSoft and Cisco are kind of in the same portfolio, and Cisco has both of these cloud collaboration platforms. So Cisco has been, there's about a number of ECG's customer support and operates Cisco systems, and ECG does consulting in that space as well. We help these customers to build and scale these networks, and especially we've done a lot of work on voice optimization and making the voice quality very good, and fixing problems like that, assisting with troubleshooting, and also network monitoring within the UCM space. We'd love to chat more if you've got Cisco deployments. So the future, what's happening now that we've talked about what these platforms are, so to introduce some terminology. Where's this going to next? So the BroadWorks development is going on without a pause. So they're already announcing their next releases that are coming out. including releases 23 and 24 of BroadWorks. There is one change that's been announced, which is the BroadSoft Meet. So the collaboration features are going away, according to the announcement, but it's a little bit unclear. That's kind of one big question. We'll talk about it a little bit more. What does it mean that their collaboration features are going away, especially in the context of certain special customer classes that have privacy, confidentiality, secrecy, or robustness requirements. You don't necessarily want your federal government to shut down because the internet's having a bad day. So the other side of this is Cisco's 7-year commitment to openness. And so this is from the Collab Summit. One of the execs said, you know, we'll continue to support all the old open APIs. There are customers, partners, service providers that have built whole solutions around that. So we Cisco would not be real bright if we tampered with that. So it's my job to do a better job than the competitor. We signed agreements with all the major brands for a continued 7-year open APIs. So this is an interesting factor since these are not public agreements. This is some of the largest and loudest announcement about this. But what they seem to be saying here is that what they're probably considering the major brands such as Plantronics, Polycom, such as Mitel, and I would guess Yealink and others that are probably kind of some of these larger brands, Adtran, Edgewater. These would be the kind of large companies that are doing a lot of work to have a very large deployed base, in addition to others I haven't mentioned. What they seem to be suggesting is that they've signed agreements to keep these APIs open for the next 7 years, and so that these developers and these other companies can continue to bring new products to the BroadWorks marketplace. And that's pretty interesting because in order to keep the APIs open, they're effectively making a long-term commitment to BroadSoft and BroadWorks itself and to BroadWorks customers. Now there's a huge installed base on BroadWorks, so it makes all the sense in the world. They seem to be very proud of their BroadWorks purchase here, and BroadWorks was already a well-operating and private profitable company before it became part of a division of Cisco. And so it looks like this is some of the news. And so what I think in practical terms this means is that we're going to see that vendors like Plantronics, Polycom are going to be able to continue to make products and integrate with BroadWorks and depend on these features. Like I mentioned earlier, one of the distinctives is on the BroadWorks side, all of the features and functions, all the collaboration features, the presence features and messaging, they're all available to every vendor through the open APIs. And so in a lot of cases, those just mean the SIP standards that are already published. Whereas on the Cisco side, there was a lot of really nice features that were implemented, but they were only available between pairwise implementations of a Cisco device to the Cisco server. So this is an interesting answer to that question. So the question came up several times. Well, what's going forward with Cisco having 2 cloud platforms? Like, where is this happening? Like, what does this mean if you're really big in the BroadWorks side or you're really big in the HCS side? What does this mean now that two companies that or 2 products that were positioned as competitors are now under the same portfolio? So Mike Tesler, as mentioned earlier, was bemused by the fact that he was put in charge of HCS. And so this was when he was pressed with this question multiple times. This was basically his answers. That HCS is intended for moving CUCM installations to the cloud or to centralized data centers. One of the pros, the major pro of HCS is that it provides a seamless user experience through that migration. So if you had Call Manager, you loved Call Manager, the features you had the devices, everything was working, then you can maintain that migration as you virtualize it or move it into HCS in any other way. There are a lot of end users on HCS, he says, and we're committed to keep that going. And so that was the strongest, most positive HCS comments he had. The ECG analysis here is that HCS, based on kind of Mike's discussion and the way he kind of pushed back against the way he was being pressed on, don't you have 2 cloud collaboration platforms? Is that the viewpoint appears to be, at least as announced, the only viewpoint that's actually been announced has been that HCS is a great way to virtualize and centralize your Call Manager installations. And so, which is to say, we're continuing the BroadWorks deployment, and we'll expect to see BroadWorks deployment and the BroadWorks customers and the product set is going to continue to grow and develop, and HCS is going to continue to be a great way to virtualize existing Call Manager installations. I see one question that came in about the BroadWorks native support for Skinny. So the AMS does provide the Skinny support, and so yeah, you already have in BroadWorks through AMS, you do have an interface to those functions for Skinny phones. And so you can bring Skinny phones that are existing, that were built, that are running on Call Manager, and bring those into a BroadWorks environment now. And I would expect that product to kind of keep going and to continue to be evolved and improved to take advantage of all the new features that they're going to bring out. Presumably that they're going to bring out. We have no forward-looking announcements that you guys don't have. So open phones or Cisco phones? So that's another question that comes up there is, what about the vendor? So I happen to have the privilege of being having a lot of respect and a lot of good contact with the engineers and the commercial guys at a lot of the companies that I've mentioned who offer competing phones. And frankly, there was quite a bit of dismay the day that at BroadSoft Connections when they announced that Cisco was purchasing BroadSoft. There was some amount of distress here. I would say, based on everything that's been said and looking at the way that Cisco as a engineering and corporate culture has integrated major working companies in the past, that the corporate culture at Cisco is one of prototyping with proprietary standards. So they bring a product to market, and then they open to public standards. So we can see that in the routing and switching space, for example, with HSRP, and they brought that to market. It was a strong product, and then they made a newer and improved version in a public space, which was VRRP. You can see that with the MGCP and how that basically turned into Megaco. And you can see that with the way that they've interoperated with H323. Another kind of element here, so beyond corporate culture, which is also very fuzzy and it's just kind of a rough expectation here, is that the Cisco support for SIP appears to be growing. So overall, if you sort of look at their features over time, their support and kind of what's available and what works properly with SIP devices is tending upwards with time. We've got Jonathan Rosenberg, who he's prominent within the Cisco Collab community, and he's the inventor of SIP. So they not only have Jonathan Rosenberg, the inventor of SIP, but they've also now brought in Michael Tesler, who made the best business out of SIP so far, most profitable and successful deployments of SIP have all been built with these guys' software. And so they seem to be gradually sort of adding more support and capability to SIP. And every feature that's been offered on the Cisco phone so far could be readily deployed with the SIP standard. Now, maybe a proprietary extension, but it would be publicly documented in order to be compatible with other vendors. In addition, we've got kind of a third leg of this theory here, which is that the collaboration and huddle space and meeting space place, which is where a lot of the activity is and a lot of the WebEx Spark excitement is, that's moving to SIP as well. And so you're tending to see organizations like Zoom and BlueJeans and others that are building their capabilities in for SIP. And the Cisco devices are largely having to interoperate with SIP just to sort of meet, to stay with the standard, but also because they want to make good devices as well. Sort of the fourth leg here is that there's a huge installed base of powerful SIP video phones that are already out there, and Cisco would really love to have that support revenue and that ongoing monthly recurring revenue for those customers. And so everything we've seen so far, all the signs from who they're hiring and what they're buying and how they generally have done things in the past, points to a culture where we really hope to see them continue to sort of take the features that they've done very well with Skinny and bring those into SIP and make those first-class features. And so while a lot of the discussion had to do with at the Cisco Collab Summit, a lot of the public announcements have had to do with, well, CUCM is a very strong, robust product. It seems that it's going to be pretty obvious that a lot of the ideas and what folks are using HCS for, which is one of Michael Tesler's sort of stated missions right now, is to sort of understand all of the use cases for continuing to use HCS, what they're using HCS for, bringing those features over and implementing them and providing them in a SIP platform. So at the meeting, Cisco also announced that the Spark brand name was being retired. It was going to be replaced with WebEx. But there's also this concept of BroadSoft Meet, which is their meeting functionality that's built around the collaboration space. The Cavill Group sort of reported based on their analysis here that the APIs for meetings and messaging will be collapsed. So that's, which is to say, between the BroadSoft and the Cisco side. Michael Tesler himself, I got a quote from him here where he said, BroadSoft Meet will eventually go away and be replaced by some Cisco technology. We don't have a date for that. And so he was, basically this sounds like roughly an intention here, kind of to not have multiple protocols that are competing and different from one another. And that makes all the sense in the world. Why would you want to bother to have separate software teams maintaining separate software stacks to do largely the same kind of stuff? Especially when some of these already do, you know, we've already got binary floor control protocol that's implemented on kind of and available through both platforms. Now, another element here is that for internet connected firms, Cisco wants to sell WebEx recurring monthly subscription. So that's a big piece of this. They want to have that. And so that would make sense that, for one thing, collaboration features are, they're basically capital intensive. So just they're kind of on the other end of the spectrum from where broad cloud is. The broad cloud idea is you don't have to have any capital. You sell devices to your customers. But if you're going to do video collaboration, this is very CPU intensive. You buy a lot of CPUs and a lot of servers in order to do video collaboration. Like the call that we're on right now with all of the people who are here right now is occupying, there's a lot of horsepower necessary and network infrastructure necessary to distribute this media. And so they want to be able to sell you that service and sell that service through partners, and also potential in other markets. I would imagine, I have no reason to think otherwise, potential in other markets to sell that service through to these end users and to enterprises, and to have recurring monthly revenue. Every shareholder wants recurring monthly revenue. But I've got a few but what abouts in here. But what about sending my media, such as this call, if this was a sensitive topic that we were talking about here and it wasn't a public forum like we are? What about sending this media through a third party? I wouldn't be very excited about using a third party collaboration platform to send that through. I may not even be allowed to do that. I may have contractual obligations to never send my media to another location. I may have requirements under privacy laws to know which countries my traffic is going through. So those are some hard problems to solve. What about in the public sector? If I've got classified or just sensitive communication, where I have to be able to keep track of where the media is going and what's being recorded. I have to be able to account for that. And so I need some answers there as well. And what if I'm one of the organizations who's responsible to keep doing my job even if the internet fails? So I may need to have my own network that I want to operate in my own data centers and my own cloud infrastructure that I provide for myself that needs to continue to operate so that we can do our job when the internet breaks. Those haven't really been announced yet. And so kind of our conclusion here is that Cisco hasn't actually really announced the plan here that fits the existing BroadWorks users and fits the existing Cisco Collab users for this meeting space. So I think that's kind of an open question. Even though we kind of have an intention to not have multiple platforms, that's been announced. We don't really have much of a roadmap for where they're going to go with this. Now we could have some speculations, and I think, and we'd be glad to talk about speculation probably in a more private setting about where this is going to go. But I think these are some interesting but whatabouts that have to be thought about here, so that if you fit in one of these categories of life safety or public sector or classified confidential type of data, that we need a solution for collaboration in those sectors as well. And it would seem anomalous for Cisco BroadSoft to completely drop that market. So what about Cisco partners and BroadSoft? So one of the big questions is, well, when can Cisco partners offer BroadWorks? And that's one of the things we're really eager to help Cisco partners with. So BroadWorks offers a feature set that Cisco service providers have not had available. So as strong as the Cisco Collab products were, this is really a distinct feature set. This is the kind of product that if you're, in a lot of cases, if you're an MPLS provider, if you're a large-scale security provider, hosted security provider, or a managed security provider, if you do, for example, virtual desktops or other types of applications that you provide large infrastructure services, then it makes a lot of sense that you would want to provide voice, because voice is how most of the business gets done. We do video for things like this that are kind of lightweight and informal, but most serious business is happening through person-to-person voice calls right now, which is why these things are still selling so well, because they're good at person-to-person voice calls, as well as being a computer in our pocket. So Cisco has announced and committed to adding the Flex licensing packages that let you buy licenses within the BroadWorks for BroadWorks functions, as well as other Cisco Collab functions, and then use those, deploy those kind of in different contexts, potentially deploy it here and then move and deploy it there. So the thought is, well, we can deploy it on a premise basis, but then move it to a cloud implementation later. that's the common use case for that. But Cisco continues to be built, and all the sort of the stars are aligning here to say Cisco bought BroadSoft largely because not primarily they're excited about being in the cloud business outside of kind of what they can do with WebEx, but because they are the company that wants to provide for the people who are building the cloud. And so this is a kind of an interesting cultural difference between sort of different words. We heard a little bit of schizophrenia at the Cisco Collab Summit. On one hand, you've got Cisco WebEx. They're very proud of the Cisco Spark infrastructure. Spark calling wasn't really discussed a lot, but the WebEx infrastructure as a meeting and collaboration space, that's a strong network there. But the interesting, on the other hand, we've got Broad Cloud, which is in order to allow resellers to sort of offer services without having to have a BroadWorks infrastructure of their own. But then most of the BroadSoft customers are really not in one of those two categories, where they're doing a large-scale meeting collaboration, or they're just a local reseller or distributor or on-site integration firm. Most of their resellers are service providers of the sort who build MPLS networks, who operate dark fiber networks, who own multiple data centers, and basically they're the folks who are building the cloud. And so, there are certain exceptions to that. You can think about some of the large-scale companies that are building the cloud, such as at the scale of Amazon and Google, but most of the sort of the infrastructure data center providers are in the telecom ISP space that are sort of not at the scale. They're not in the category with Amazon and Google and Microsoft, but they're kind of what you could call the second tier cloud providers, the cloud builders, such as companies like AT&T and CenturyLink and Verizon. So they may be in the second tier of that category, but they're in the top tier for general organizations offering service. And then there's a lot of small companies around the world where there's a lot of innovation and sort of a lot of easy development that can happen in the sense that there's a lot of good technology that hasn't yet been implemented in most of the world. In the global South, we haven't seen a large implementation of this, and we've got sort of an aging telecom infrastructure in many of these countries. And at the same time, you have new interest in 5G networking and the capabilities that brings us for a new and improved voice infrastructure. And so there's a lot of opportunity there around the folks who are actually building the infrastructure. So it appears that despite the move and the interest in the WebEx side, there is a lot of interest in Cisco in being able to continue to sell and to offer to service providers. So some of the schizophrenia I mentioned was, on one hand, they're very proud of how big the WebEx network is, but on the other hand, they've never wanted to operate hosted voice platforms themselves. They said, we have 3 to 5 organizations that sort of forced Cisco to operate hosted community collaboration solution deployments, ACS deployments, and we just did it through professional services. So basically, you had organizations that are apparently buying blocks of hours and setting up a contract to have Cisco operate this equipment for them. But it's not something that they've wanted to do to be able to operate these kind of services. So we'd love to chat more. I'd be glad to take other questions if you've got some more questions that you can bring up here. We see I've got one question here, which is what was your analysis on the Flex licensing and Cisco's comments about portability? Seems like they're moving to the model that looks massively disruptive to the service provider community. I haven't seen that really spelled out well enough to know what to believe there. What I have seen, like I just mentioned, was a strong interest in being able to service the service provider community, and kind of a lot of belief that a lot of the sales in the future were going to come from that service provider community. I wonder if they're being sort of pushed by the board to at least have an answer to the Microsoft business model. But on the other hand, there's so that they're not kind of left behind, and so Microsoft's not considered to be the only game in town. I think it'd be interesting to talk about that in the future weeks, as we talk about future webinars, or if we have some one-on-one conversations where we can talk about what's happening with those business models. But definitely there's a gap where in the space where Cisco has not quite connected all the dots and spelled everything out for the partner community. We'd love to help you, though, prepare when you get to that point to you who are Cisco partners and you work with Cisco partners. We'd love to help you prepare to work with BroadWorks as it comes along, and to, as you grow and expand these networks, or if you just want to be prepared to have that offering, or even to make wise judgments on moving forward in those spaces. Jan, any final comments for us?
Don't have any more questions. There were a few people who did request, I guess, the earlier announcement. We will have a recording of the webinar, and we'll be sending that out, and we will share the slides with you. That completes, I think that's all the other questions that we had, but we appreciate your participation today.
Great. Thanks for coming, everyone. Send us an email. Keep in touch.